Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, this week we are having discussion on modern India. We'll start with the conquest of British, and you all know they came as traders, but over the time they become rulers. So we'll talk about their philosophy, their main ideology, and how they expanded their power in India. So we'll start with this, and in a subsequent lecture we'll talk about the different aspects of others period of modern India. So I hope this is the first lecture, and in this will come to know early British expansion in India and its ideological orientation. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. Manoj Sharma. He teaches history in Kirodimal College, University of Delhi, and has keen interest and eye on the how British India and modern India is related there. His study of research is this. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. Sharma for EduSet's lecture on this very topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. So today we will talk about the early British expansion in India and the various ideological orientations. We all know that British, they came as traders to India, and after some time they became rulers. So the various ideological or various philosophical trends of British, they could be seen in India as well. When we talk about the British, we generally talk about the 18th century. The Battle of Plassey and the Battle of Buxar, they were the important battles initially, because of which British could gain control over India. They could expand and enhance their power, and over a period of time they could consolidate their hold over India. The transformation of British from traders to rulers over a period of time, because of the ideological orientations as well as the practical policies which were followed by them, were a very important development in modern Indian history. The British sense of superiority, they considered themselves to be superior in nature, and they considered Indians as totally inferior. The sense of racialism, the way Indians they were being treated in different spheres of administration, was another important factor, the way in which British treated the Indians. Before going to the ideological orientations, the kind of influence, the kind of origin they had, let us briefly talk about the kind of capitalism in India which British brought. Mercantile capitalism was one kind of capitalism which we can see in India initially. India got bullion when British they came as traders to India, and that bullion was in the form of gold and silver, because British took a lot of finished products from India and exported it to Britain. In a way, we can say that India became the sink of the world, as the wealth of India was increasing over a period of time. The various exports from India increased India's wealth and made it the sink of the world. After the phase of mercantile capitalism, we can very well see the phase of industrial capitalism, as industrial revolution had already taken place in Britain, and the British industries they required raw materials, and these raw materials they had to be taken from India to Britain. They were being exported from India to Britain, and so that the British industries they could be fed on them. The Indian handicraftsmen they lost because of this, because the cost of the raw materials it increased over a period of time. So they lost as buyers, and over a period of time they also lost as sellers, because when the cost of production increased because of the increase in the cost of the raw materials, then they were not being purchased in the Indian market. So, that way it had an impact in terms of deindustrialization also. And at the same time, you can very well see that the burden on the Indian agriculture also increased, because these handicraftsmen, they shifted to agriculture. So, the burden on agriculture, it increased, and the industries could not develop in India. Secondly, the costlier Indian products, they had to compete with the cheaper products which were machine made in Britain. In this way also, the Indians, they also lost. The third phase of capitalism was the finance capitalism. The opportunities for investment in Britain, they were dwindling, they were drying up. So, now the British, they had surplus capital, and they did not know where to spend this surplus capital. And in India, they could find the avenues for investment. For example, in railways, in telegraph, etc., a lot of British capital was invested, and this British capital, they got handsome interest on that by the Indian or by the British government which was ruling in India. Now, talking about the ideological orientations, when talking about the ideological orientations of the British, we can say that the British idea of themselves as an imperial people was charged with the governance of others, had its origin in the discoveries and conquests of the 16th century. The 16th century explorations going to different parts of the world, because of which the British, they got a lot of information about the outside world. And when they went to the outside world in terms of trade, they expanded their empires as well. Their consideration when they went to Ireland, that Irish people, they were the barbarians and they were uncivil. Who would benefit from the British presence was an idea which was used to justify their subduing of Ireland and setting up of their plantations. So, Irish people, they were considered as uncivil, they were considered as barbarians in nature, and now British felt that it was their divine responsibility or ordained responsibility to civilize these kind of people. Sir Thomas Smith, he argued that God has given the English responsibility to inhabit and reform this barbarous nation. So, British, they got this kind of ideological thrust from the philosophers or the thinkers, those who said or argued that British, they had this kind of responsibility to civilize the barbarous nations. With the conquest of Ireland, British became the new Romans, charged with the civilized backward people. The English took this rationale for the subjugation of foreign people from Ireland to America, then to India, Asia and Africa. So, we can very well see as the Roman Empire during the earlier part, which took this responsibility to civilize the people from different parts of the world in order to expand its own empire. In the similar manner, British, they also took this responsibility to civilize people in different parts of the world. We can also see the idea of patriotism and the Britishness which developed during this time. The British patriotism, evoked by frequent wars, further got strength from expansion of British power across the seas. When British, they went to different parts of the world and they began to stranglehold the different regions under their control, then they thought that then the idea of patriotism, it originated in them, and the growth of the empire and the conviction of the Britishness, they went together. Secondly, the British, under the influence of the ideals of enlightenment, they announced that their own preeminence as a modern and civilized people. They considered themselves that they were the modern people, they were the civilized people, and now it was their responsibility to civilize people from other parts of the world. And when one is talking about that one is more civilized, one is more modern, one is more progressive, then one has to cite that the other is not civilized. So, they tried to describe themselves as enlightened, modern or progressive, and which also meant that someone else had to be shown as a savage or a vicious or primitive or backward. So, the people from different parts of the world where the British ruled, they were seen as these kinds of people, those who were primitive in nature, those who were backward, those who were savage, and now they had to be civilized by the superior British rule. Such alterity, what one might call the creation of doubleness, was an integral part of Enlightenment project. This process had as its outcome the creation of an array of polarities that shaped much of the ideologies of the Raj. The notion of British during the early 18th century, that the people of Great Britain, they had to construct a view of themselves as an integral nation, and various nationalities in terms of English, Scots and Welsh, they were merged into one community, and this one community was set apart as British from others. So, the idea of British, the idea of Britishness and the idea of other, those who were uncivilized, they gained prominence during the 18th century in the ideological or the philosophical framework or the viewpoint in the British circles. When they viewed India in terms of despotism, and they referred to it as Oriental despotism. When we talk about despotism, we say that despotism is a style of governance in which legitimate royal power was nearly the same as that of a master over a slave. So, despotism means that the subjects of a state are in a way slaves to that ruler, and the ruler has complete mastery or control over the slaves. In 18th century, we can very well see that Europeans argued that despotism described the way Oriental states were organized, because the Oriental states, they had such kind of rulers, those who were savage in nature, and they had complete control over their subjects. The term carried with it the connotation that Asian countries had no laws, and hence its people no rights. They believed that the Asian countries, they were being governed by the will of the ruler, and there were no definitive laws, as the ruler defined the laws, and in a way the people, they had no rights whatsoever. So, this was one of the ideas which we can very well see in the 18th century. The later British writings on India gave a new life to the concept of despotism. It was now a way of contrasting India's earlier history with the law and order that the British conceived they were bringing. The British writings, they suggested that India was some sort of a lawless state. There were no laws which were there in India, and now British, when they came to rule India, they were bringing a number of laws, and the Indian subjects, they had to follow these kind of laws, and by following them they will become more civilized in nature. When we talk about Orientalism, Edward Said, he argued that Orientalism was a knowledge which was thrust from above through the power of Europeans. So, this argument in itself is a prejudiced argument, because in the sense that the Europeans were the not only people, those who provided this kind of knowledge and thrust them to the people, those who were living in the East. Contrary to it, there are others, those who argue that, for example, Eugene Ischik and many others, those who argue that it was produced through a process of dialogue in which the colonial officials, Indian commentators and native informants participated in a collaborative intellectual exercise. So, the other view, it argues that it was not thrust on the natives or the Asians, rather there was some kind of collaborative effort, some kind of interchange or interaction in the ideas between the colonial officials, Indian commentators and native informants, and it led to the creation of the idea of Orientalism. Orientalism in practice in its early phase could be seen in the policies of the company's government under Warren Hastings, when Warren Hastings he became the governor of Bengal, he followed certain policies because of which we can very well see the ideas of Orientalism. The fundamental principle of this tradition was that the conquered people were to be ruled by their own laws. British rule had to legitimize itself in an Indian medium. They argued that the Indian laws which were being made, they had to be applied when the Indians they were being governed. In the sense that some people they have also argued in terms of reverse acculturation. It is therefore needed to produce knowledge about Indian society, a process which Gauri Vishwanathan has called reverse acculturation. Reverse acculturation means that British they were getting accultured because of the things or the policies or the ideals which we find in Orientalism. It informed the European rulers of the customs and laws of the land for the purpose of assimilating them into the subject society for more efficient administration. The European rulers they had to assimilate these laws of the land, and so that reverse acculturation also takes place. This political vision led to the establishment of Fort William's College at Calcutta in 1800, and it was established to train civil servants in Indian languages and tradition. So, we can very well see that British they were also ready to borrow something from the Indian traditions and culture, so that their administration is also smooth. But at the same time we have also to agree to this fact that Orientalism was also rejected. The Orientalist discourse was initially premised on a respect for ancient Indian traditions. It produced a knowledge about the subject society, which ultimately prepared ground for the rejection of Orientalism as a policy of governance. So, it was suggested that Orientalism as a policy of governance was not conducive for British to rule in India, and it had to be rejected. And at the same time, these scholars they highlighted the ancient glory of India, but now they emphasized the subsequent degeneration of Aryan civilization. They suggested that the Aryans, those who came to India from Europe, now that Aryan civilization it has witnessed or seen some kind of degeneration. So, the Oriental despotism or Orientalism has to be rejected, and new policies have to be followed by the British. This legitimized authoritarian rule, as India needed to be rescued from the predicament of its creation and elevated to a desired state of progress as achieved by Europe. So, this idea was also given credence that the authoritarian rule has to be legitimized, and this legitimization of authoritarian rule also took place. When we talk about the early Orientalism, we talk about Warren Hastings. He patronized Oriental learning, and he prepared the way for the development of work of British Orientalism or Orientalists in India. Warren Hastings wrote the introduction to the first English translation of Gita or Bhagavad Gita by Charles Wilkins. William Jones was another scholar who came to India, and he established linguistic connection between Sanskrit, Greek and Latin, and he suggested that they all belonged to a group of Indo-European languages. So, these kind of ideas were generally seen in the 18th century. During this time, we can also very well see that William Jones laid the foundation of Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784, with the purpose of enquiring into the history, civil and natural, the antiquities, arts, sciences and literatures of Asia. So, Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784 aimed at regeneration or finding more about the arts, sciences and literatures of Asia. So, it was in a way a thrust to Indian literature, Indian language. At the same time, we can very well see the establishment of Calcutta Madrasa in 1781 and Sanskrit College in Banaras. They were meant to promote the study of Indian languages and scriptures. And when we talk about these kind of institutions, we can also talk about the Delhi College. The Delhi College, which is now the Zakir Hussain College, it also developed during the 18th-19th centuries. Then we can, after Warren Hastings, we can talk about Cornwallis. Warren Hastings' policy, it was abandoned by Lord Cornwallis, who went for greater Anglicization of administration. He had a low opinion about Indian character, ability and integrity. He considered them to be corrupt. The higher posts in the administration and army could not go to Indians. So, this kind of policy was followed by Lord Cornwallis. He paid higher salaries to the British administrators in India. He sought to improve their honesty so that they may not become corrupt. But at the same time, when he increased their emoluments, their salaries, he never thought of applying the same methods to Indian administrative personnel. They were being lowly paid. So, these kind of ideas about rejection of Indians, considering them as corrupt and totally inefficient, was generally seen during the reign or period of Lord Cornwallis. These ideas of prejudice and racialism, they also lasted throughout the British rule in India. We can very well see the idea of racialism, to consider Indians as inferior and to treat them at par, in a way that Indians, they were not being allowed to go to the various clubs. In many clubs, Indians, they were not being allowed to go inside, and they were treated at par with the dogs. And in some of the films also, you can very well see that dogs and Indians are not allowed. So, these kind of slogans, they were written outside the European clubs. So, this was the kind of attitude and mentality which we can very well see during this time. Lord Cornwallis also wanted to improve the finances of East India Company, for which he introduced the permanent settlement in Bengal. The permanent settlement was introduced in 1793. Under the arrangement, or under this settlement, the zamindar would have to pay the government virtually 10/11 of the rent which they would realize from the tenants, and retain for themselves as cost of collection and compensation only 1/11 of it. In a way, it recognized the proprietary rights of zamindars on their estates, and they were entitled to enjoy it till they fulfilled their obligations. So, the idea of zamindars' proprietary right over the land was very well seen in the permanent settlement, which was introduced by Lord Cornwallis. N.K. Sinha is one of the scholars who has written in his work the economic history of Bengal, and he says that the government sacrificed nothing in making the settlement. Rather, government was one who earned a lot of benefits because of the introduction of the permanent settlement. The amount of the assessment which was fixed on the lands where permanent settlement was introduced was very high, and it was as high as had never been assessed in many instances, and it was higher than ever realized by the exertions of any government, whether it was Mohammedan or British. So, this we can very well see that permanent settlement, it provided a regular supply of revenue to the British government. Now, they were not afraid of the kind of fluctuations which were there in the monsoons, because now the amount of revenue which they will receive, it was more or less fixed. About permanent settlement, Beveridge pointed out that by not accepting the settlement, zamindars, they were ruined at once, and by accepting the permanent settlement, they were ruined after some interval. So, the ruination of the zamindars, they had to take place, whether it takes at once or whether it takes after a period of time. The permanent settlement also stipulated about the sunset law. The sunset law it talked about that zamindars were to deposit their revenue in the government treasury by sunset of the last day which was fixed for the purpose. Otherwise, their lands would be confiscated and they would be auctioned. So, the sunset law, it demanded from the zamindars that whether they sell their zamindari or they appropriate or collect revenue, whatever means they want to, but they had to submit their revenue at a particular point of time, and if they failed to do so, then they had to forfeit or they had to give up their zamindaris. So, in a way, land became some sort of a property which could be easily bought and sold. Earlier, the notions about land was with regard to the emotional attachment of the zamindars or the peasants towards the land, but now land became a sellable commodity which could be easily sold or mortgaged to others. Politically, if we see, then we can very well say that East India Company gained support of the zamindars, which was an influential class because of the introduction of permanent settlement. At the same time, it stabilized government revenue and relieved it from extra burden of yearly assessment and set free the ablest servants of East India Company for judicial services and other reforms. By setting up or introducing permanent settlement, some of the ablest servants of the company, they could be utilized in other services. They were now not bothered about the collection of revenue, because now it was all fixed. And as we have already said, that it resulted in the creation of property rights in land by means of land tenures. The person who succeeded Lord Convalesce was John Shore, and his ideas, they also reflect the kind of ideology the British they wanted to perpetrate on the natives or the Indians. John Shore, he said that the fundamental principle of English had been to make the whole Indian nation subservient in every possible way to the interest and benefit of ourselves. The Indians, they have been excluded from every honor, dignity or office, which the lowest Englishmen could be prevailed to accept. So, in this way we can very well see that the British interests and the benefits, they became or they remained paramount in the British policies, and the kind of policies they followed, their commercial interests, they were the most prominent aspect of these policies, and the kind of positions which were being denied to the Indians in the higher administration, they could be easily given to any Englishman, but any ablest Indian was denied such kind of positions in various spheres of administration. After this, we see an important Governor General who was Lord Wellesley. Lord Wellesley, when he came to India, he wanted to make company supreme power in India, for which he followed various policies, and one of the important policies was the policy of Subsidiary Alliance. By Subsidiary Alliance, we mean that Indian state, it had to surrender its external relations to the company and conduct negotiations with other states through company. The Indian state could not decide it had to maintain any kind of foreign relations with other states. The other states, any kind of foreign relations with the other states had to be decided by the company. They had to follow the diktat of the company. A bigger state maintained an army commanded by a British officer, for which the ruler ceded territory for its upkeep, and a smaller state paid tribute in cash to the company. So, a British contingent had to be maintained by the state, for which the state had to cede a territory or pay the amount in cash, and the smaller states, they had to pay an annual amount, so that the British, they can provide protection to them. At the same time, the state had to accept a British resident. A British official was stationed in the Indian state, and in the long run, as we can very well see, that the British agent, he interfered in the day-to-day administration of the Indian states. No Europeans were to be employed by the state without consulting the company. The company said that no Europeans, they were to be employed, and if they were to be employed, then the consent had to be given by the company. The Subsidiary Alliance, it brought a number of advantages to the British. Firstly, Subsidiary Alliance system was considered to be the Trojan horse tactics in empire building. Because of the Subsidiary Alliance, Wellesley was able to secure a lot of support, a lot of military strength, a lot of finances, and it helped in the empire building in India. Moreover, secondly, we can say that it enabled the company to establish or maintain a large standing army at the expense of Indian princes. Now, because the Indian princes, they had to pay for the army which was stationed in their own states. So, but the army was under the command of the British. So, in this manner they could command a larger army within context of India. Thirdly, we can say the stationing of the company's troops in the capital of the Indian princes gave English control of strategic and key positions in India. When the British troops, they were being stationed in the Indian states, so they were placed at key positions and at the strategic positions. In that way, the British gained. Moreover, the company became arbiter in inter-states disputes. If there were any kind of disputes between various states, then the company, it became some sort of an arbiter, because now company was negotiating with different states, and if there was some kind of conflict or some kind of misunderstanding with regard to any kind of agreement, then the British, they settled their disputes. So, in a way, the British gained from this perspective as well. The British resident wielded considerable power in affairs of the Indian states. We can also very well see that the British resident over a period of time, he became more and more powerful in the Indian states, and he started to interfere in the day-to-day administration of the state as well, which created some kind of conflict between the rulers and the British resident, as we can very well see in the case of Jhansi and in other states, which created some kind of conflict or antagonism between the rulers as well as the British. Moreover, we can very well see it in terms of the disadvantages which occurred to the Indian states. Indian states, they became subordinate and they lost their independence. The Indian states, they were subordinated to the rule of the British, and now they were no longer independent. The British resident, he interfered too much in the internal affairs of the state. So, this way also they lost. Moreover, it led to the financial troubles in the states, as huge sums of money had to be paid to the company and its officials by the states. A part of the territory was also sometimes ceded, so that the revenues for maintaining, or the money for maintaining the military contingent could be raised. So, in this way the Indian states, they were becoming poorer. At the same time, we can also say that the British state supported every weak and oppressive ruler, and it deprived people of any possible remedy against misrule. The states in which some kind of misrule was there, those states were also supported by the British, and the rulers and the subjects, they did not have any kind of opportunity to get rid of this misrule, because they were being, the state or the ruler was being protected by the British. Another important ideological orientation can be seen in terms of paternalism of the Raj. The policy of paternalism, it came from the consistent disdain for Oriental despotism, from which Indians needed to be emancipated. So, the British, they wanted to suggest that the Oriental despotism was a very negative kind of governance, and the Indians, those who were under this kind of governance, they had to be emancipated from this kind of misrule. And despotism was something which that distinguished the Oriental state from its European counterparts. The European counterparts, they were living in the age of humanism, rationalism, in age of democracy, etc. And despotic and Oriental despotism had to be removed, and in a way the paternalism of the Raj, it had to replace it. It was the same logic that provided an implicit justification for the paternalism of the Raj. The emergence of a strong state on premise that natives were not used to enjoying freedom and needed to be emancipated from their corrupt and abusive feudal lords. On the one hand, many British officials, they exhibited paternalist attitude, and on the other hand they supported authoritarian rule in India. On the one hand, they were talking about that Oriental despotism should be removed, but at the same time they also wanted that more and more authoritarian rule should be applied to India. And one purpose of Fort William College was to prevent the spread of the ideas of freedom preached by French Revolution. The French Revolution, which preached the ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity. So, all these ideas of modern ideas of democracy, good governance, etc., they were not to reach the Indians. The Indians, they should not become party to such kind of ideas and ideals, because Indians were not fit for such kind of rule. Eric Stokes has said that there were two distinct trends which emerged in Indian administration of East India Company. On the one hand was the Cornwallis system, which was based primarily on permanent settlement. Cornwallis introduced permanent settlement with the hope that rule of law and private property rights would liberate individuals' enterprise from the shackles of custom and tradition and would bring modernization to the economy. But Thomas Monroe in Madras and his disciples in western and northern India, such as Mount Stuart Elphinstone, John Malcolm and Charles Metcalfe, thought that Cornwallis system did not pay attention to Indian tradition and experience. And that is why we see that how Monroe introduced Rayatwari settlement with the intention of preserving India's village communities. But his ultimate objective or aim was to consolidate company's estate in the south by expanding its revenue base, where land taxes would be directly collected from the peasants by officials of the company. So, the Rayatwari settlement is stipulated that the Rayats or the subjects, they should pay their revenue directly to the company or the British officials. Another historian, Burton Steen, he has suggested that both systems were based on same fundamental principles of centralized sovereignty, sanctity of private property to be protected by British laws. So, whether we see it in terms of permanent settlement, we see it in terms of Rayatwari settlement, Burton Steen, he has argued that the fundamental principles, they remained the same. The idea of centralized sovereignty, where British, they had to rule, the sanctity of the private property, that had to be maintained, and British rules, they were paramount in deciding all these aspects. The authoritative paternalism, it rejected the idea of direct political participation by Indians. The authoritative paternalism, it suggested that Indians, they should not directly participate in the political development in India. The respect and paternalism were the two complementing ideologies of the early British Empire in India. Apart from this, we also see certain other new intellectual trends or currents during this time. The new intellectual currents in Britain, they preached the idea of improvement and thus pushed forward the issue of reform in Britain and in India. Hutchins has argued that two schools of thought, Evangelicalism and Utilitarianism, they asserted that conquest of India had been by acts of sin or crime. Both of them, instead of advocating the abolition of this sinful or criminal rule clamored for its reform, so that Indians could get the benefit of good government in keeping with the best ideas of their age. So, both these trends, they were not talking about abolition of any sinful or criminal rule, rather they were augmenting the argument that these kind of improvements which should take place, they should be authoritarian in nature as well. From these traditions, the conviction that British should stay in India permanently was ultimately to evolve. So, the idea that British they should remain in India permanently, it evolved out of these traditions, the idea of improvement which came because of the ideologies which were prevalent during that time. When we talk about evangelicalism, we say that it began its crusade against Indian barbarism and advocated the permanence of British rule with a mission to change the very nature of Hindustan. It also argued that Indians they were barbarians and British rule it will change the nature of Hindustan by applying their own laws and rules. In India, the propagators of these ideas were the missionaries which were located at Sri Rampur near Calcutta, and in Britain chief exponent was Charles Grant. So, the missionary activity which was carrying on in India, it also saw Indians as barbarians, and they wanted that more and more conversion to Christianity should take place, so that the civilizing mission of the missionaries or the Christians could take place in India as well. Charles Grant he argued that in 1792 he argued that religious ideas they perpetuated ignorance of Indian people, and this can be solved by dissemination of Christian light, and in this lay the noble mission of British rule in India. So, the people those who were associated with these kind of ideologies, they also propagated these views that Christianity had certain kind of light, and this light would also remove the kind of darkness which engulfed Indian religion or Indian religious traditions. And these ideas were given popularity by William Wilberforce in British Parliament before the passage of Charter Act of 1813, which allowed Christian missionaries to enter India without any kind of restrictions. William Wilberforce he argued in the British Parliament that the Christian missionaries they should be given there should not be any kind of restrictions on the Christian missionaries when they come to India. They should be given the kind of free passage so that they can carry on their activities in India in terms of civilizing them. At the same time, the free trade merchants they also advocated the idea of improvement and change, and felt that India would be a good market for British products and a supplier of raw materials if company became a ruler instead of a trader. So, in the later phase we see that this kind of ideology also got a thrust from the free trade merchants. The free trade merchants they also favored this kind of India, that company instead of a trader should become the ruler, so that more and more benefits could occur to them. Fundamentally, we see then we can very well say that there was no major difference which existed between evangelist and free trade merchant positions as regard the policy of assimilation and Anglicization. They also both of them they favored the policy of assimilation, that how the Indians they could be assimilated in the sense that more and more benefits could be taken from them, and how they should be Anglicized so that the British products could be easily supplied to Indians. They become the consumers of those British products. Another evangelist, Charles Grant, he presided over the passage of the Charter Act of 1833, which took away companies' monopoly rights over Indian trade. After 1833, we can very well see the monopoly of the company over the rights of the Indian trade, it was taken away, and now others could also join in the party, in the sense that others could also join in the spoils or the riches which India offered. Another important ideological trend which we can very well see during this time is liberalism. Thomas Macaulay liberal vision that Thomas Macaulay's liberal vision that British administrators' task was to civilize rather than conquer set a liberal agenda for the emancipation of India through active governance. Other liberals like Trevelyan, etc., they also talked in this vein. It was in this atmosphere of British liberalism that utilitarianism, with all its distinctive authoritarian tendencies, was born. Jeremy Bentham, who is considered to be the father of British utilitarianism, he argued that the ideal of human civilization was to achieve the greatest happiness of the greatest number. He also argued that the good laws, efficient and enlightened administration were the most effective agents of change, and the idea of rule of law was a necessary precondition for improvement. So, all these ideologies, they are talking about the rule of law, and that rule of law was a British rule of law, which Indians they had to follow. They were subjected to these kind of laws which were being framed by the British, and these laws they were being considered to be superior in nature. James Mill was another utilitarian who transformed utilitarianism into a militant faith. He argued that for improvement, India needed an effective schoolmaster, that is, a wise government promulgating good legislation. So, in a way, the question of authoritarianism is present in almost all ideologies which are being during the 19th century. When we talk about the education, the educational reforms which came to India, liberal Lord Macaulay, in his Education Minute of 1835, he sought the introduction of English language, while utilitarians like James Mill favored vernacular education which suited to the Indian needs. So, there was some kind of division, some kind of friction with regard to the kind of education which should be given to the Indians. Lord Macaulay wanted to transform the Indians into a Brown Sahib, that the Brown Sahib should have the taste, the opinion, the intellect of a European, so that these Brown Sahibs could relate to the British rule. They become more receptive to the British ideas, and they become more subservient to the British ideology. Though through the Orientalist and the Anglicist debate on the nature of education in India, the persistence of the dilemmas in imperial attitudes towards India in the first half of the 19th century, they were reflected. The British, they were not very sure the kind of dilemma they had, the kind of policies or the kind of things they should impose or inculcate in India, that we can very well see. And Lord William Bentinck was an epitome of this kind of dilemma. He had faith in utilitarian philosophy, and he abolished sati and child infanticide through legislation, because utilitarian philosophy believed in legislation. So sati and child infanticide, they were being banned or they were being abolished in India during his governor generalship. But at the same time, he retained his faith in the Indian traditions and cited ancient Hindu texts as scriptural logic in abolition of sati. So, he goes back to the Indian scriptures in terms of abolition of the sati, citing them as reasons so that sati should be abolished. The revolt of 1857 which we see, it convinced many in Britain and in India that reforms were dangerous and Indians could never be trained to become like the Englishmen. And in British, they should be cautious in terms of following any kind of policy of reform, so that they may not antagonize the Indians as they had seen during the revolt of 1857. Now, their approach could be seen in the sense that now they emphasized India's, not only India's differences, but also its inferiority, that Indians, they were more and more inferior to the British. In the later ideological orientations or philosophies, one was by Rudyard Kipling, who talked about the white man's burden, the white man's burden of civilizing the Orient savage, that the Europeans or the whites, they have this kind of burden over them, that the savages or the colored people, they should be improved or they should be made civilized. Such racial utterances and ideological orientations were the bedrock of British rule in India, which we can very well see. In retrospect, when we try to see the various methods which were employed by the British so that they could exercise their control over India, we can very well see that British, they secured revenues from various areas, and they all at the same time they sought control, direct control over various regions. Securing revenues would give them a constant supply of money, which could be utilized for their personal for the gain of the company. And at the same time, the control over various areas, it also provided them some kind of benefits which they could utilize for their further expansion and consolidation in India. For example, the Diwani rights which they acquired after the Battle of Buxar by the Treaty of Allahabad, the Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, and from there on how British rule it expanded to various parts of India. Moreover, they interfered in the affairs of the princely states, the various princely states of India. They also saw a lot of British interference, be it in terms of subsidiary alliance, be it in terms of stationing of a political resident. They witnessed a lot of interference. At the same time, British directly fought a number of wars, not only in India, but they also utilized Indian resources to fight wars abroad as well. The various Anglo-Mysore wars, the various Anglo-Maratha wars, wars in Sindh, etc., which were fought by the British, Anglo-Burmese wars, wars with Afghanistan. All these wars, they had their own, they had their one ideology, the imperial ideology, to gain as much as possible from these areas so that the British rule could flourish. I would also like to highlight in retrospect the permanent settlement of Lord Convalesce, which we have already discussed very well, and the subsidiary alliance of Lord Wellesley. Both these also helped British in consolidating their empire. The drain of wealth from India to Britain in form of investments in the sense that the kind of revenues which the British could seek from the Indian states, they were being invested by the British in purchasing products from India, and then these products they went to Britain, for which India did not get anything in return. Moreover, when we are talking about drain of wealth, the home charges of the company which were being paid in Britain, they were also taken from the Indian revenues. The servants of the company, they were being paid from the Indian revenues, and the pensions and the salaries of the British officials, those who were derisively called as the British Nawabs, people like Convalesce, people like Hastings, they were derisively called Nawabs in Britain, because they amassed so much wealth from India that people they became critical towards them. At the same time, the economic policies with regard to trade and industry which were being followed by them, they were also very important, the kind of policies, they also reflected their ideology. The commercialization of agriculture, the British, they commercialized agriculture. The various crops which were being grown in India, they were converted into cash crops in the sense cotton, indigo, jute, etc. They were being grown more and more, so that they could be easily exported from India to Britain, so that they can feed the British industries. The doctrine of lapse of Lord Dalhousie, which stipulated that no native state could adopt an heir, and if an heir was adopted, then the tika or tilak was to be given by the company. So, these kind of laws, they antagonized Indian states, but at the same time the motive of the British was to secure as much as revenue, as much as financial benefits from these states. I would also like to talk about the British forest policy, though in organized form we see it in later stages. The British forest policy was commercial in nature, because the various forest areas in India, more and more forest areas were being converted into the reserve forest areas, and when these reserve forest areas, they were to be utilized by the British for their own growth and development. Indians, they were being debarred to enter these reserve areas, and the people, those subsistence was dependent on these areas, they were being debarred to enter such areas. And that is why we find that because of the forests, a number of revolts, they also took place. The various tribes like Santals or Chenchus of Hyderabad, etc., they revolted in various measures, because the British, they denied them their customary rights in the forest. The motive of the British in preserving or conserving forests for themselves was to secure as much as wood, so that the railway expansion could take place. And at the same time, they also wanted that the British ships, they could also be manufactured because of the high quality wood which could be found in the Indian forest. The furniture needs of the British, they were also met by the Indian forests. So, the Indian forests, they also catered to the imperial vision or the imperial rule, and British, they had some kind of direct political control and benefit over the Indian forests. And in reaction we can very well see that some of the Indian tribes, they rose in revolt. So, Indian forest policy was also the British forest policy was also imperial in nature and was designed to serve British interests. Moreover, British followed the policy of divide and rule, which we can very well see after the revolt of 1857, but initially also they wanted to take sides between different rulers. They wanted to divide the rulers so that they seek help of British, and when they sought help of British, then they could use them to their own advantage. So, this was another policy which was more reflected after the revolt of 1857, but initially also we can very well see when they took sides so that they can help their own cause. So, we can very well say the guiding principles of the British were, though the ideological orientations were there, but the practical approach was different. The guiding principles were pragmatism, the practical application of the various policies in the framework that they can secure as much as benefits from India was the guiding principle. At the same time, the British greed, they wanted to secure as much as possible from India, be it in terms of raw materials, be it in terms of finished products, be it in terms of revenue, be it in terms of money which was drained from India to Britain, be it in terms of bribes which the company officials or the top officials like even Warren Hastings and Convalesce, those who took a lot of bribe from India, and how they were being tried in Britain at that time. And these were the people, those who considered Indians as corrupt, but at the same time they themselves they indulged in such practices. So, the political expediency which was followed by the British, was another guiding principle which we can very well see. Their economic self-interest, that how their interest that should be safeguarded, that was another important consideration in following various economic policies in India. The idea of racialism, that Indians they were inferior and British they were superior, and how India it has degenerated because of the Oriental despotism, and how they were to be in a way civilized or reformed by the British, the ideas of humanism, the ideas of rationalism, the modern education which will be given to the Indians by the British, the kind of sense of superiority that was there which was evident in the British practices. In a way, we can sum up by saying that they wanted to oppress India in whatever measure, in whatever way they could, and their ideological orientations which may have or which did in fact in some measure affected the Indians or the Indian political administrators in India. But the guiding light in terms of policies was the idea of pragmatism, racialism, sense of superiority, political expediency, and the economic self-interest which guided the British policy. Thank you.
Okay. Well, friends, this was really enlightening lecture on the early British expansion in India and their ideological stands. So, I hope today's lecture must have helped you to understand the basic concepts in regard to the British expansion and their philosophy. Tomorrow, we will discuss on another topic and the same resource person, Dr. Monroe will be available for the lecture. So, with this word, we conclude the lecture today. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf, I thank Dr. Monroe for giving such a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.